prices about 30% higher. And obviously that will have some long-term gain.
All right, guys, welcome back to Revive School. Here we are. It's a brand new lesson, brand new book of the Bible. Kevin, that's kind of exciting. I mean, we just finished up Jeremiah. We wrapped up Isaiah not too long ago, honestly. And here we are continuing on with the major prophets. Now, Lamentations is not a prophet. It's a prophet lamenting over the city of Jerusalem. I mean, this is the reality of all of the destruction that has happened to his people. And so you have one long book. It's really not that long, but it feels like it. You got 5 laments, 5 chapters, and it's just kind of like, man, Lord, I know why I haven't ever taught on this before. Because it's not that exciting. Look, I have no problem saying that. And yet the reality is this little book, when you spend time digging into it, can honestly help you. Saying that, and yet the reality is this little book, when you spend time digging into it, can honestly help you. Saying that, and yet the reality is this little book, when you spend time digging into it, amidst it all, can honestly part of the Revive School's purpose is to point out, where do you see the Messiah in every single book of the Bible. And Lamentations is no different. And Lamentations, to me, as you're lamenting, you still have to find hope. You still have to look for, you know, the light at the end of the tunnel. And so when you look at Lamentations 3:22, and it really goes into verse 24, listen to this description. It says, because of the Lord's faithful love, amidst it all. We do not let Revive School's purpose is to point out, where do you see the Messiah in every single book of the Bible. And Lamentations is no different. And Lamentations, to me, you still have to find hope. You still have to look for, you know, the light at the end of that tunnel. And so when you look at Lamentations 3:22, in every single
don't open until you see mommy. Huh? You see mommy? Open the door then. Don't open until you see mommy. You see mommy? Open the door.
Down. Daddy, look down.
What is this? What's that now?
Hey, look down. Look down at my feet.
Huh?
Here we are, the brand new lesson. We just Jeremiah too long ago. Here we are, continuing on with the major prophet. Now let's take we got prophet. It's prophet lamenting over the reality of all of the destruction that has happened in people. And so you can look at that long book. It's really not that long, but it feels like you're just 5 chapters.
Daddy, so you started at 196, right? Guess how much?
Let's guess. Did you reach 1,000? Let me see. 1,011.
Let's see about that.
Oh,
That
huh?
was
How
right.
about you? How do you guys think? How do you guys think?
Good. So how do you we don't. Happy birthday, Children. Birthday card. كان 3% off على البارك جدا. Oh my God! أنا ده بيشيلني من المنظر دوري أبي ثاني إيه لا إيه يا بچه شو لا ما يجي إنسان
يعني ايه اللي تقوله يا مدحت؟ تقولوا بقى كسرات كده بتاعته.
Kind of like, man, Lord, I know I have a problem with you. It's not that exciting. Look, I have no problem saying that. And yet the reality is, this little book, when you spend time digging into it, can honestly help you.
This can help. ايه اللي يتعشى قبك وهلا بيقبض وش السلامة ولا ها؟ ها؟ بقول رفته باي سارة
You know, the light at the end of the tunnel. When you look at Lamentation 3, in every single book of the Bible. The Lamentations is no different. And Lamentations, to me,
No.
got fruit.
Oh, that's my information. What was the meeting? Wait, what?
Milk.
It's like a little wide. Wait, but it's like. Wait, Dad, you're making those videos?
I have to clean.
You made this 9 minutes ago? Oh, yeah. Hi, What do you mean? Oh, I and my mom. Oh no. And you can look at I said I'm gonna get you lots of kippers. I got kippers. 2 kippers. Like Matthew made a market. And you made the the children does. You can do that for the I said and you're going to market here and you must be in the cosmos. Slowly, very. And Mama, say something in the cosmos, okay? So I need in the cosmos is please entertain me. Everyone needs to listen. I actually need them to listen. So I want to believe. Stop. Robin, you're in the cosmos. Get out. Get out of the cosmos. So everything is going fine. You guys. So I need everyone to believe I am actually my little princess, which is right here. Please do that for me, or my mom can't do anything. I really need that. Thank you. Oh, the night for that in the month. Um, what happened, mommy? So, yeah, just help me. Everyone thinks now I'm one thing because I'm one here. Help. Is fine. From the Holding, finding, holding, we can almost long things are not so quick. It's just so culture. Please help. You're the one who every thought you talk again. everyone to know from the real thing. That was know what she's doing. What? So time, you know what my saying is doing. Know what to do. The little baby.
What are you guys doing? I done?
No.
But I have
Puppy.
Yeah, I agree.
Most time, I don't know, right? And still bring food.
Bobby, what do you want me to water in my table? Then I know question to move water. Don't put water in anything here. What are you guys looking at here?
Wrong username. How did you? Oh,
Huh?
I
No? I don't know.
Mom, if I get out of this grant, it's gonna be the best year of. Tell it here, and then it's. Yeah. You don't know, maybe not know how to do it. How you can yeah. Like you can read the literature, but you've never tried to do it. Yeah. It's just the scary.
Oh, hi.
Burrito. Oh. Did you kill the watchtower?
Don't disturb me. Guys, don't disturb me. I'm so behind. طبعا عنده سايد كافيك شوالو عنده سايد ولا هذا جوس من هذا اللي فاتي
Yeah, it's dry. It's hot.
Fine, don't say that word again. Abracadabra is bad word.
Oh my God. Go there already.
የዛገና ነው አላልሽም? ያቆይል አንቺን በልቶ
ሁለተኛ ፓስፖርት ወጥቶልኝ ነው የሚገርም እኮ ነው። ወስዶ እሱ ሚያዝያን ትቶ መጋቢት አርጎ አወጣ ፓስፖርት ለኔ ተሳስቶ። መጋቢት ማለት ሜይ ማለት ነው። ከዛ እንደገና So it's you have to keep it like this. Rather than you know, like you know, oh, okay, put my phone. Put my phone now. Let's see what's better. Does it recreate stuff?
Who opened that? Okay, put down that. What did I say? Everywhere, I'm gonna cover to you. Just put it down and focus on your assignment. Either you have nothing to do, sit down and do your work. Read a book, either. They didn't bring the last time from library for you?
Guys, don't ask me because like every single time different stuff. Then we can always lunch in the middle. Okay?
The Casco book, start with the Casco book, okay? The Casco book you said, you remember? You're gonna work, yeah, we'll do work then.
Yeah. Oh my God, I'm like, it's smart. Okay.
All right, guys, welcome back to Revive School. Here we are. It's a brand new lesson, brand new book of the Bible. Kevin, that's kind of exciting. I mean, we just finished up Jeremiah. We wrapped up Isaiah not too long ago, honestly. And here we are continuing on with the major prophets. Now, Lamentations is not a prophet. It's a prophet lamenting over the city of Jerusalem. I mean, this is the reality of all of the destruction that has happened to his people. And so you have one long book. It's really not that long, but it feels like it. You got 5 laments, 5 chapters, and it's just kind of like, man, Lord, I know I haven't ever taught on this before. Because it's not that exciting. Look, I have no problem saying that. And yet the reality is this little book, when you spend time digging into it, can honestly help you find hope amidst it all. Part of the Revive School's purpose is to point out, where do you see the Messiah in every single book of the Bible? And Lamentations is no different. And Lamentations, to me, as you're lamenting, you still have to find hope. You still have to look for, the light at the end of the tunnel. And so when you look at Lamentations 3:22, and it really goes into verse 24, listen to this description. It says, because of the Lord's faithful love, we do not perish, for his mercies never end. Okay, so think about that just for a second, Kevin, back in 22. You probably feel like your life is over in those moments. I'm serious. Like, I don't know how I'm going to pay for this. I don't know about how I'm going to deal with my family who's dealing, with this illness. My relationship is hard. School is tough. Whatever the context is, like, it really feels overwhelming. It feels there's a huge burden. You can just see it on people. You can feel it on yourself. But remember, God's faithful love, man, he's constantly there. And so it's like this drip. And I know Mindy has an awesome description of this, but it's like God's just pouring out his mercy. He's pouring out his love, and it never stops. And then in verse 23, he says, these mercies, they're new every morning. So when you wake up, no matter how hard your life is, no matter how bad the situation is, God just keeps pouring out his mercies. It's unbelievable, isn't it? Because your mercies are new. It's like, great is your faithfulness. And so here's the phrase that we want us to have in verse 24. I say, the Lord is my portion. Therefore, I will put my hope in him. So here's the deal. When you are in a season of lamenting, and it's okay. Lamenting is not a bad thing. Lamenting, crying out to the Lord, is not a sign of weakness. You know what it really is? It's you saying, God, I can't do this. I need you. And so when I see this phrase, my portion, okay, I understand it's not capitalized. I understand, it kind of throws it off a little bit. But really, my portion is how you get through these dark times. And what you're going to hear is all throughout the book of Lamentations, us looking for, how is the writer looking for hope? How is the writer looking for his portion in all this process? And so when you look at the title Lamentations, it conveys this title, and John MacArthur does a great job for backdrop of the book for me. It conveys the idea of loud cries. That's what you're talking about, these loud cries, and it's derived from the translation that actually comes from the Latin Vulgate and the Septuagint. And so no other entire book really consists of just laments. You can't really just find a book that's this depressing. As does this distasteful dirge. I mean, I don't know how else to describe this. Like, I have no problem saying what he's going to describe, you guys, is legit. What he's describing is like, there really isn't anything that exciting. So it's a follow-up to what Isaiah prophesied about the Babylonian captivity, the fall of Jerusalem. But it's really about the heart of Jeremiah, possibly, which we'll get into. And so this book, what this book does, and I love what John MacArthur says, this book actually keeps the memory alive of the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC. That's really what this is. Do you remember how bad it was? I want to make sure you remember that. And so that's kind of really what we're looking at. And so that's kind of your title now. The author-wise, it doesn't ever say that this book was written by Jeremiah. Okay, you can't, but you can imply, I mean, based on the internal and historical indicators that this was Jeremiah. There's a lot of things that Jeremiah would have seen, and it really makes sense that it could have been Jeremiah. So go to Jeremiah 7:29. There's at least couple illustrations. Maybe again, Jeremiah 7:29. By no means am I saying it's 100%, but kind of look at this mentality. Jeremiah 7:29. Okay, so God told Jeremiah, like, there needs to be a time of lament. Cut off the hair of your sacred vow and then throw it away. Raise up a dirge on the barren heights, for the Lord has rejected and abandoned the generation under his wrath. So there's this mentality of a lament. Okay, not saying there is. I'm just saying there's this mentality of lament. In fact, can you go to 2 Chronicles 35:25? 2 Chronicles 35:25. Okay. And again, by no means, but look, Jeremiah then, remember when Josiah died and Jeremiah chanted a dirge over Josiah? Basically, he was lamenting, basically he's writing on behalf of the life of Josiah. And so there is this, and all the singing men and singing women still speak of Josiah and their dirges to this very day. There was something about whatever Jeremiah wrote, there was a form of lament in this. So it obviously is going to come natural for Jeremiah. So again, did he officially write it? We don't know. But I think what you'll see based on what we're describing, because you guys, here's the reality. This whole thing is a lament over Jerusalem. Okay, so if that's the case, we know that Jeremiah very clearly was predicting what? If you can go to that timeline for me, Tom, the kings and the prophets. During or soon after, I mean, what? Jeremiah would have experienced the prophecy of the Babylonian captivity, and he would have experienced what? The captivity actually taking place, and the fall. The total destruction of Jerusalem. So if there's anybody that has an eyewitness account, it's going to be Jeremiah. So to me, this makes sense. I mean, think about this. John MacArthur says it was mid-July when the city of Jerusalem fell, mid-August when the temple was burned. Okay, likely, we can't even say this enough, but there's a really good chance he saw the destruction of the walls, the towers, the homes, the palace, and the temple. We're going to get into that more and more today. And he would have wrote while the whole event remained painfully fresh in his memory. So, and this would have been taking place before his departure into Egypt in 583 BC in Jeremiah 43. So he would have seen this. There's a really good chance he would have witnessed this. And so if you do want to do a comparison, it's kind of interesting. Can you go to Jeremiah 30, verse 14 for me? I'm just going to do just a little bit of a comparison of the lament, of a prophetic lament. Jeremiah 30, verse 14. Okay, here's a picture. Kevin, if you would. Jeremiah 30, verse 14 says, all your lovers have forgotten you. They no longer look for you, for I have struck you as your enemy would, with the discipline of someone cruel because of your enormous guilt and your innumerable sins. Okay, this is a language. Okay, now if you go to Lamentations, Kevin, 1:2. Okay, here you have the same language. Lamentations 1:2. She weeps aloud during the night with tears on her cheeks. There is no one to offer her comfort, not one from all of her lovers. All of her friends have betrayed her. They have become her enemies. And so there's this similar language that you can do a comparison from Jeremiah to Lamentations, Lamentations to Jeremiah. And I have at least 5 references here just from Jeremiah and Lamentations that you could walk through the comparison. We're not going to do that, but just to give you an idea. All right, a couple other things, background and setting. Now, if you're new to Revive School, we always take a lot longer on the book, introducing the book, because honestly, I just think, and this is kind of what's refreshing for me with Revive School, is we're getting to know more of the backdrop, which really paints a bigger picture of the whole thing. And so you're not just reading Lamentations 3, 22, 23, and 24 because you know that's supposed to be a magnet verse. You're like, why is he actually writing this? Well, a couple things. If you go to Joshua 23, 15 through 16. Joshua, not Jeremiah, Joshua 23, 15 through 16. Watch this. Since every good thing the Lord your God has promised you has come about, so he will bring on you every bad thing until he has annihilated you from this good land the Lord your God has given you. Verse 16. If you break the covenant of your Lord your God, which he commanded you, and go and worship other gods and bow down to them, the Lord's anger will burn against you, and you will quickly disappear from this good land he has given you. So what you have, even in Joshua's time, is these prophetic pictures, right? That if you do this, Kevin, what will happen?
Good things.
And if you do good things will happen. If you do bad things will happen. So there's this language, this mentality with his own people. Look, man, I'm making a covenant deal with you guys, but you got to kind of live up to your own deal. And so Joshua kind of has this language, okay? That was 800 years earlier. Now, here you have Jeremiah. We know this. He's the guy that's been walking around for 40 years, okay? He's clothed, not Isaiah. And Jeremiah prophesies, judgment is coming to your people. And that's exactly what he's saying. He's saying, judgment is coming to your people. My people, it's coming. And so here you have this picture that when judgment actually comes, it's going to come through, as we talked about this over and over again, judgment's going to come through King Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian army. Also, the Chaldean people are going to be coming in. And so what does Jeremiah do when the prophetic word comes to fruition? He weeps, he's sorrowful, and he laments. Just because he released the prophetic word doesn't mean he likes it. It doesn't mean he wants this to happen to Jerusalem. It doesn't mean he wants this to happen to his own people. And so what you constantly are seeing is that this Lamentations, it so parallels with Jeremiah. Why? Because Jerusalem is being judged for their unrepentant sins.
How many times did Jeremiah warn them? They didn't listen to him. And then it's even greater what he has to say. He didn't want to do that, but he lives into it.
He lives into it. He walks into it. And now he writes about it.
Yeah.
At least 4 times you have in Scripture, at least 4 times. Tom, you alluded to this yesterday. Jeremiah 52 talks about the destruction and the downfall of Jerusalem. So you have that in Jerusalem 52. You have that in 2 Kings 25. You've got that in Jeremiah 39. You've got it in Jeremiah 52, and you got it in 2 Chronicles 36. 4 times you see descriptions and pictures of the downfall of Jerusalem. And the crazy thing is, you guys, is we still haven't seen Jerusalem being fully restored yet. Even in our lifetime, we still haven't seen it yet. People are arguing over a president moving an embassy to the city, saying this is the city that God has chosen, and people are still arguing over that. It's crazy how all of this stuff is just like, it's a big deal. And so here you have, just to kind of conclude kind of our wrap up, I should say, when you're doing a background and a backdrop of a Lamentations, there's 154 verses. And as weird as these 5 chapters, and I'm not belittling the word of God when I say that, but as weird as this lamenting is, and you're like, I'm not going to just pick this up and go charge for the day. Oh yeah, how should I get motivated for today? I'm not picking up Lamentations 1, okay? Sometimes I am. I'm picking up Lamentations 3 because I got to hold on to it because he's my portion. But the reality is 154 verses, and the Jews believe that this is the sacred canon. Like they never really have ever questioned this. In fact, Ruth, Esther, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, and Lamentations. Okay, we've actually referenced this in Revive School. There are 5 Old Testament books. Forgive me if I'm going to mispronounce this, but Megilloth, Megilloth. They're the 5 scrolls, and they're read in the synagogues on special occasions. So specifically, Ruth, Esther, Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, and Lamentations. They're not that long. Now, Lamentations is read on the 9th of Ab, A-B, in July or August, which I think is really cool. Why? It's read to remember Jerusalem's destruction by Nebuchadnezzar. They don't want people to forget. They don't want people to forget. Why is it important? Let's just go there. Why is it important that they don't forget about the destruction of Jerusalem? Kevin, what would you say? Why is it so important? Who cares?
Because it's God's chosen city.
So it's God's chosen city, but what's our learning? What's our lesson about why God did this? Tom, what would you say?
Don't forget, when you break the covenant, God will keep his word, and it will break your heart.
Yep. So destruction came because of sin. So God brought about his judgment. So if I'm a people, I'm the Jewish people, and I'm opening this up and I'm reading this every year, I'm like, man, let's not be those people, because what's God going to do? So this is the reality of what they're after. And so interesting enough, it's the same date that marked the destruction of Herod's temple by the Romans in AD 70. Kind of an interesting perspective on what is taking place. So a couple things. Again, the chief focus in all of Lamentations is God's judgment in response to Judah's sin. That's what this is. This is God's judgment in response to Judah's sin. And you have over multiple themes. You have, John MacArthur says, one of the themes is you have hope found in God's compassion, God's sovereign judgment. You have sweeping judgment that came across and yet to end every hope for Israel's salvation. Like it looked like it was horrible. It looked like there was no hope in any of this. And then here you have one of the major themes is Jeremiah's tears. When you think of the book of Lamentations, Jeremiah's tears, we're going to get to that, you guys, in Lamentations 3. I don't want to cover it today, but I will have no problem just telling you this. Like it is in full-on foreshadow of Christ weeping over Jerusalem as well. And so if there's anything of a takeaway, here you have a prophet who's weeping over the city that God had plans for, and Jesus does as well. And so I don't want to miss that. We didn't want to call Jesus, we didn't want to call the weeping prophet in this. It could be totally called that, but we didn't have a specific reference of how that would allude to. So just know that we're okay if you want to say those type of things. It's clearly Jeremiah weeps over his people just like Jesus does as well. And I will tell you this whole book, 5 chapters. Okay, 5 chapters, 5 laments. Kevin, here's what I love about this. Okay, with the exception of one, it's divided into 22 separate sections. Rich, being our in-house scholar, why 22 sections?
That would be one for each letter of the Jewish alphabet.
That's right. So here you have 5 of these laments. Today we're supposed to cover 2. Okay, we're going to really cover 1. Okay, it's talking about the suffering for sin. Talking about the sorrow of sin. That's what we're going to talk about. Lamentations 2 talks about the days that are no more. Okay, so that's about your Lamentations 2 right there. So let's jump into Lamentations 1 if we can, Kevin. And really the first 11 verses, I know I just said that it wasn't personal, it was more communal, but I will tell you the very first 11 verses is the exception. Okay, the first 11 verses really talk about Jeremiah's sorrow if you adhere to the fact that it would be Jeremiah. Okay, so Jeremiah's sorrow is going to be in the first 11 verses. So it says this, how she sits alone. The city once crowded with people. She who was great among the nations has become like a widow. The princess among the provinces has become a slave. So clearly, Kevin, he's talking about what city? Jerusalem. And he compares Jerusalem, you guys, to a widow. Jerusalem is this desolate widow where she didn't have anybody. He also describes Jerusalem as a princess, and now it's like a slave. It's not really a great picture of Jerusalem being lonely, Jerusalem being literally that their people are mourning, and she's alone. The temple's gone. Multitudes of sins are there. So in verse 2, Jerusalem, she weeps aloud during the night. With tears on her cheeks, there's no one to offer her comfort. In other words, late at night when you go through a hard time, you look around, you're looking around, and you're like, hey, who can help me? Nobody. And so as they're looking around, not only her lovers aren't there, her friends aren't there. And in fact, the lovers and her friends, the ones that she wants to find comfort, Scripture says they become her enemies. Those that she thinks she can trust. So who would be some of these people? Well, the lovers or the friends, they could have been, you guys, the pagan nations that Judah allied themselves with. And guess what? They're not around. And it's a picture, it's a thought, but here's the point in verse 3, Judah has gone into exile. Kevin, that word exile, it's kind of floated around loosely. Where did Judah go?
They went off to Babylon.
They went off into Babylon, following affliction and harsh slavery. She lives among the nations, but finds no place to rest. You know what's interesting about that? Is that when you're in bondage, when you're in slavery, do you know how restless you are? Like I keep going back to this image of nighttime. I feel like for me, when people are really wrestling and struggling, they don't get any sleep. I think about my kids going through school. You know what happens? They come into my room, I can't sleep. They come into my room, I can't sleep. Why? Because they're always thinking about something, but they're trying to find comfort. They're trying to find comfort, but they can't find it. Hopefully, yes, with us they can, but the context of Judah is there's no place to rest. And in fact, the rest truly, it's interesting. It's because they left the promised land. They're out of the promised land, you guys. There's no rest in this component. The problem is they couldn't find it. They couldn't find rest. In fact, in verse 4, it says this, the roads to Zion mourn, for no one comes to the appointed festival. So think about this. They're not in the land anymore. There's no rest. And let's just imagine that there were people sitting next to the road. They're waiting for people to come to the festivals. Remember the 3 famous festivals? You got the Passover, you got Pentecost, you got the Tabernacles. Nobody's even coming to these things. All of her gates deserted. Her priests are groaning, whether the priests are actually in Judah and they're fleeing to Egypt, or maybe they're actually in exile, hoping to get back. But either way, they're mourning because nothing's happening anymore. Like the great and glorious holy city of Jerusalem, of Zion, nobody's flowing in and out. Nobody's flowing in and out of the city. Verse 5 says this, her adversaries have become her masters. Her enemies are at ease, for the Lord has made her suffer. Because of her many transgressions, her children have gone away as captives before the adversary. I think this is probably one of the saddest pictures, actually, in verse 5. And you could say, well, how so? It says her children have gone away. There's no sign of potential growth. The kids are gone. They're gone. There's no sign of like, is there ever going to be any growth into this land? Is there ever going to be any hope where it looks completely dark? Verse 6, and remember, this is just Jeremiah. All he's doing, you guys, he's lamenting. He's distressed. He's literally having loud cries saying, God, how have we gotten to this point? And in verse 6, all her splendor has vanished from daughter Zion. Her leaders are like stags. They find no pasture. They walk away exhausted before the hunter. And scripture continues in verse 7. During the days of her affliction and homelessness, Jerusalem remembers all her precious belongings that were heirs, all her precious belongings that were heirs in hers in days of old. When her people fell into the adversary's hand, she had no one to help. The adversaries looked at her, laughing over her downfall. In Jerusalem, here's the reality. Jerusalem has sinned grievously. Therefore, she's become an object of scorn. She becomes, you guys, the laughing stock of the nations. All who honored her now despise her. And then look at this next verse. It's really graphic, but it says, for they have seen her nakedness. She herself groans and turns away. What does that mean? It means that the wretched state of her sinfulness is all exposed to everybody. That's where that nakedness picture of no clothes, just this is who I am. And it's not pretty. And builds on this and builds on this. In fact, Tom Constable says Jerusalem has embarrassed herself. And then it says in verse 9, her uncleanness, if you go to verse 9 for me, her uncleanness stains her skirts. She never considered her end. You know what that means? It means she never really thought about all of the sin that she was doing. She never thought about the consequences. You think about this. Her uncleanness stains her skirts, and then she never considered her end. Isn't that the truth, you guys, when you're walking in rebellion, when you're walking in sin? You never really think about, how does this actually impact somebody else? That's why, to me, it's one of the saddest things when families split up. It breaks my heart, actually, families that have kids and parents divorce. Look, I'm not here to judge on reasonings. It's not for me to say. I'll just tell you, though, whatever that reason is, whatever happens, the kids have to go through all kinds of junk. I'll never forget interviewing Jackie Velasquez when we had a radio program earlier on in the days of Time to Revive, and she was doing a study. In fact, she was ministering to people, but she always said it takes 7 years, to recover mentally from their parents getting a divorce. That's not meant to make anybody feel bad, but I want us to think through the consequences when you go through these things. In this text right here, I didn't even think about my end. I didn't even think about how this actually impacts somebody else. And isn't that the truth how Satan works? He doesn't care about, he just wants you to fall. And her downfall was astonishing. Look, and in the process, there's nobody there to comfort her. In verse 9, it says, nobody is there to comfort her. Nobody's there, even though the stains on her skirt, even though she didn't even think about the end, she's exposed herself naked. Nobody is there to help. Look on my affliction, for the enemy triumphs. And that's exactly where Satan wants all of us. Satan is here to steal, kill, and destroy. And guess what? He did a great job through his people, through God's people in Jerusalem. And Jeremiah is just looking at this whole scenario like, what has happened? And in fact, it gets so bad, you guys. Let me say this in verse 10. The adversary has seized all of her precious belongings. She has even seen the nations enter her sanctuary. You know what that means? Kevin, what does that mean? What nations are walking into where?
All the nations have walked into the temple.
Yep. And then it says in verse 11, it's talking about, man, they don't even have food, you guys. All her people in Jerusalem, they groan while they search for bread. They've traded their precious belongings for food in order to stay alive. Look and see how I have become despised. Jeremiah is just sorrowful over the city of Jerusalem because of sin. But now you got to flip it. Now you got to flip it in verses 12 and on, 12 through 22. Now what we would consider this would be, and most would agree, here you have Jerusalem's sorrow. So now you're going to have a corporate perspective, okay? A different way of looking at it. It's an insider's perspective from Jerusalem looking out, okay? Does that make sense? And so this is what you're seeing here. It said, is this nothing to you, all you who pass by? Look and see, is there any pain like mine which was dealt out to me, which the Lord made me suffer on the day of his burning anger? He sent fire. Look at this image. You're going to see God's judgment poured out through different images, okay? So one of the images is you're going to see fire, okay? Another one that we'll get into is a net. Look at this. It says, he sent fire from heaven into my bones. He made it descend. And then he said, it spread like a net for my feet and turned me back. He made me desolate, sick all day long. Can I just tell you, when there is sorrow and when you're dealing with this stuff, you get sick sometimes. I'm not saying because you're sick, it's because of sin. I'm just saying, but this is one that you can go to. He made me desolate, sick all day long because, man, what in the world is going on? Anybody ever been to that point? You're so sick to your stomach about a situation. In verse 14, the scripture continues on. He says, my transgressions have formed me into a yoke. Fastened together by his hand, they've been placed on my neck. And the Lord has broken my strength. He handed me over to those I cannot withstand. And so, again, another form of judgment, fire, a net, and yoke. It's so heavy, I can't, what in the world? You brought me under bondage to the Babylonians? He says in verse 15, the Lord has rejected all the mighty men within me. He summoned an army against me to crush my young warriors. The Lord has trampled virgin daughter Judah like grapes in a winepress. And so again, you just see different images, you guys, of, the judgment and how it's expressed. Fire, net, a yoke, a weight, warriors are coming against me. And then look in verse 16. He says, I weep because of these things. My eyes flow with tears. There's no one nearby to comfort me, no one to keep me alive. My children are desolate because the enemy has prevailed. Zion stretches out her hands. There's nobody to comfort her. The Lord has issued a decree against Jacob that his neighbors should be his adversaries, and Jerusalem has become something impure among them. Very rarely do you ever hear that language. Jerusalem, you guys, is listed as impure. Verse 18, the Lord is just, though. For I have rebelled. Look at this. You hear this confession? I have rebelled against his command. Listen, all you people, look at my pain. My young men and women have gone into captivity. You want to know why the Israelites, you want to know why Jewish people need to read this every year? You want to know why we need to understand this? Because look what happens when we rebel against him. We cannot forget about lamentations. A time of lamenting sometimes actually comes from our wretched sin. And I don't want you to forget the pain as I look at Jerusalem falling apart. My temple is completely destroyed. Please, we've even lost our kids. Verse 19, it says, I've called to my lovers, but they've betrayed me. I got nobody. My priests, the elders, they perished in the city while searching for food to keep themselves alive. Verse 20, look, see how I'm in distress. I am churning within. You know what that means? I am not settled. I'm not restful. Why? Because I'm in exile, or I'm looking at the situation like I'm not where I'm supposed to be. My heart is broken, for I have been very rebellious. I will tell you, in a period of lamentations, you guys, in a period of crying out to the Lord, you have to get to this point where your heart is broken and you realize you are rebellious. That you realize that I realize I am walking in sin. We need to realize that. Outside the sword takes the children. Inside there is death. And finally, as we wrap up in 21 and 22, people have heard me groaning, but there is no one to comfort me. All my enemies have heard of my misfortune. They are glad, actually, that you have caused this, God. Bring on the day you've announced so that they may become like me. And finally, verse 22, let all their wickedness come before you and deal with them as you have dealt with me because of all of my transgressions. For my groans are many and I am sick at heart. This is real. This is a very real situation for somebody looking at a situation. Family's gone, city is gone, and they're turning to the Lord. And here's the deal. When you get to Lamentations 3:22 through 24, you're going to realize the only way you can get to this point, the only way is, one, you have to recognize the sinfulness, and two, guess what? God says you can still come to me. When you realize that I am your portion, he'll carry us through this. All right, guys, this is the book of Lamentations 1 and 2, and we will cover just one chapter tomorrow on the book of Lamentations, chapter 3. Thanks. All right, guys, welcome back to Revive School. New week, same book, Kevin. We're still lamenting. Oh, woe is me. Oh, look, let me just tell you this. Lamentations is not for the, like if you're really going through a season that's really hard and you think, why would I want to read a book that's going to make me feel worse? I'm going to actually tell you, it actually doesn't. It actually brings hope in the process. Here you have a guy, Jeremiah. Think about this. More than likely, we can't prove that, okay? It's not a proven fact that Jeremiah wrote Lamentations, but more than likely, he actually got to experience, this is kind of crazy, he got to eyewitness like all of the destruction. There's a good chance he got to experience the fire, a good chance he got to experience some type of disaster that came upon the city. And then what is he doing? It's probably fresh. They think probably before Jeremiah 43, maybe before he took off to Egypt, he probably wrote Lamentations. There's a thought behind that. Can I prove that? No, again, it's just multiple studies from different theologians. So here you have a guy, he's lamenting. Now you got to understand, Jeremiah, his description of Jerusalem is not the only one. You have it in 2 Kings 25. You have it in Jeremiah 39, Jeremiah 52, and 2 Chronicles 36. So at least 4 different types of specific illustrations of the downfall of Jerusalem. Well, Jerusalem is God's holy city. Why does anybody even care about Jerusalem? Can I just ask the question? I mean, it's not like it's Rome. It's not like it's Atlanta. It's not like it's Dallas. Like, why do we always talk so much about Jerusalem? What's the big deal if it's destroyed? You guys want to add anything to that?
I think it goes back to when David said, I want to set up a place for the Lord. And the Lord says, I choose this as my city to dwell in.
Yeah, that's good. So you have to have this bigger picture. And I think sometimes that's really the heart of this. When you go to Psalm, can you go to Psalm 132? And it's pretty cool. Psalm 132, Kevin, verse 13 and 14, specifically describes Jerusalem. It says, for the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his home. Verse 14 says, this is my resting place forever. I will make my home here because I have desired it. Time frame, okay? Can you go to the Kings and the Prophets? Okay, this is during, okay, let's just say David's time frame. Okay, this is a song of ascent, okay? So here you have the Kings and the Prophets. Kevin, this would be in David's time period, okay? Solomon's time period, okay? So here you have a description of Jerusalem and how it's God's home. But then all of a sudden, here you have Jeremiah or even Isaiah. These prophets, the major prophets, they know that God's home is Jerusalem. So when you hear and see that God's home is literally destroyed, you almost feel like, where is the hope in any of this? And so I want to paint this picture. It's cool. When it says my resting place forever, Kevin, I think we can be rest assured forever actually means forever. It actually means even though temporarily it never looks good, eternally, this is the home that Christ is going to come and set up shop. How cool is this that our Messiah is coming back to Jerusalem on Mount Zion? Remember the Mount Olives is going to split and he's going to make Jerusalem his home. He's going to make Israel his home. And so when you see something destroyed in our flesh, we're like, well, God can never redeem that. Well, yeah, he can. And he does. And, you know, we're going to go to this theme, Kevin. I think this is a cool picture of how Jesus is specifically our portion. And we're going to get to that today in Lamentations 3, that even though things don't look good, we have to hold on to the hope that he is going to get us through it all. And that's what you're going to find in Lamentations 3. And in fact, Kevin, there's 5 total laments in Lamentations. You know, the first 2 we talked briefly about yesterday. We talked about how, and this comes from Philip Graham Ryken, and Ryken describes these laments as poems, okay? So you have to view each lament, okay, as a poem. The first lament is about the suffering for sin, how we're going through this process of suffering because of what we've done, okay? There's a recognition that this is what actually has taken place. Lamentations 2, which you didn't really talk about much, but the lament is the days are no more. Like, oh my, it's not like it used to be. Then today, where we're going to go to and we're going to hang out today, Jeremiah really begins to express his grief by pleading for mercy for the one who suffers. Okay, that's really where we're going to go to today. So again, there's 5 laments. The fourth lament is going to talk about a failure of leadership. The fifth lament is going to talk about, and I love this one, and I can't wait till tomorrow, a prayer for renewal, a prayer for revival, a prayer for restoration. I see what I see, but God, could you do something more? And so this is where we're going to unpack. And so what's kind of interesting is that the first 20 verses, okay, what John MacArthur did is he describes Jeremiah's distress. Now, this sounds funny when I ask this question. Okay, guys, let's go to Rich. When you think about the word distress, just how would you define distress? What comes to your mind about distress?
I think of somebody who is anxious over a situation that they feel is overwhelmingly oppressive.
Okay, that's an awesome definition, because when you look at Lamentations 3:1, look what he says. I am a man who has seen affliction under the rod of God's wrath. Okay, how has he seen the affliction, Kevin? Jerusalem is destroyed. Jerusalem is wiped out. I cannot emphasize this enough. He has a personal experience with the city of Jerusalem, and now he's completely distraught. And he says, he's driven me away and forced me to walk in darkness instead of light. He's talking about God. Jeremiah is describing God's driven me away, forced me to walk in darkness instead of light. Yes, he repeatedly turns his hand against me all day long. How many of us have ever gone through a time period and you're constantly like, you're blaming God. You're mad at God. Oh, he made me do this. He put me in this situation. Doesn't this sound like Jeremiah? I mean, it's a lament. He repeatedly turns his hand against me. God, where are you in this situation? And then verses 4 and 5, he's worn away my flesh and skin. He's shattered my bones. In other words, physically, he's experiencing sickness and pain. I think it's an interesting picture. Nelson's actually says, I've aged in this process. Verse 5, he says, he's laid siege against me, encircling me with bitterness and hardship. Like, do you hear about this lament, though? Do you hear, Kevin? Everything's like, why are you doing this to me? You've done this to me. Me. It's like the focus is all on himself. And when you're in distress and when you're lamenting, that's really what it is. In verse 6, it says, he's made me dwell in darkness. Very similar, you guys, to verse 2, where it says he's made me walk in darkness. He says, you've made me dwell in darkness. Dwelling means like I'm hanging out here. Like those who have been dead for ages. Some people even describe this as, maybe he's even describing the grip of death. Maybe he's even feeling like it's so bad, like almost to the point, I like what MacArthur says, it almost feels like I died a while ago. Like it's so bad, why am I even here? Verse 7, just so you know, doesn't get any better in this section, okay? It's just called Lamentations. He's walled me in so I cannot escape. He's weighed me down with chains. You know, this is kind of an interesting picture here. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you never felt like you could get out. But this is the best description of it. He's walled me in and there's no way out. How do I do this? You know, it's interesting. Some people would say, well, maybe it was just because he was actually in prison. It's a thought. Can you go to Jeremiah 38, verse 6? Again, it's a thought. It could be physically, or it could be emotionally. It could be mentally. Jeremiah 38, 6. So they took Jeremiah, they dropped him into the cistern of Malchiah, the king's son, which was in the courtyard, the guide's courtyard, lowering Jeremiah with ropes. Okay, there was no water in the cistern. Now, here's what I like about this picture compared to Jeremiah. Okay, this is a cool picture. Okay, so if we go to Mindy's painting over here, here's that cistern. Remember, Jeremiah was thrown in there, and then all the dead guys. Remember, they're all dropped in there as well. Like, I don't know if Mindy's mentality was this, but to me, this could look like a cistern as well. But what's the difference between this one and that one, Kevin?
That one doesn't have any water that you can see. That one does.
Yeah, and what you're going to find in Lamentations 3 is even though he might feel like he's there, Lamentations 3 is going to say, yeah, but God's going to provide what he needs in the quote-unquote cistern. And I think there's a cool picture. He's my portion. He's going to display his new mercies. But at that point, you guys, he feels walled in, and how on earth do I get out of this thing? I promise you guys, there's so many of us, like this is us right now. You have no idea how you're going to get out of this relationship. You have no idea how you're going to get out of your financial distress. You have no idea how you're going to get out of this this job situation, or you have a friendship issue. Like he's weighed me down with chains. But Kevin, look who he keeps saying who's doing all this. God. Verse 8, he says, even when I cry out and plead for my help, this is really actually quite depressing. He rejects my prayer. So like, God, I'm crying out, I'm pleading with you, and yet You have no desire. What? You reject my prayer?
It's his perspective of what he sees of God right now.
Like, God answers our prayers. He just answers it differently. And he might reject Jeremiah's prayer because he needs to prove a point so that they could get to this point to get to the next step. But you can't stay in this place in verse 8. Watch what it says, you guys. If you would, keep going to verse 9. Here it is again. Can you not feel like he's in bondage? He walled in my ways with cut stones. He has made my paths crooked. That's really encouraging, by the way. Like, we want God to do what, Kevin? To make our paths straight. Here, listen how he describes God on this one. He's a bear waiting in ambush, a lion in hiding. Verse 11, it says, he forced me off my way and tore me to pieces. He left me desolate. You have to understand something. Physically, he could have just seen the destruction of Jerusalem. Where's my home? Where are my friends? Where are my family? Where are you, God? You've left me completely alone. And then he says in verse 12 and 13, he strung his bow, and just when he thought it couldn't get any worse, and set me as a target for his arrow. So now all of a sudden, God's an archer. And now all of a sudden, the human beings are his target. He pierced my kidneys with his arrows. I am a laughing stock to all of my people, mocked by their songs all day long. Jeremiah literally, Nelson says it the best, he's the butt of all of their jokes. Why, Kevin? Why would he be a laughing stock if this is what Jeremiah prophesied?
Because God gave them every opportunity to turn around and they didn't pay any attention.
So something's building up in Jeremiah, verse 15. It's an interesting process. Why is there bitterness? Rich, what do you think? Why would there be any ounce of bitterness from a prophet? You got any thoughts? If this is what he already prophesied.
He's just expressing him living out everything that he prophesied, and it's uncomfortable. And so he's getting bitter with the Lord. It's like, I didn't do anything to deserve it. All these other people that sinned against you are the ones that deserved it, not me.
Yeah, like he has an emotion and he's expressing it to God. Can I just tell you, if you have an emotion towards God, express it. Like, don't hold it in just because it's not right. I know this sounds weird, but like if you're angry with God, tell him. Like if you're frustrated with God, tell him. I think this is one of the things that you can learn in Jeremiah's distress is at least he's talking to God. At least he's not shutting down and like not going there. He's going there. And I think that's part of the lamenting process. He wants you to talk to him. I think about my kids, my daughter Maya, she's going through track. She doesn't really like it all the time. They make her run all the time. But guess what? She still tells me that it's hard. She still tells me my feet are sore. She still tells me my thighs are sore. I want my kids, even if it's not good, to tell me how they're feeling. And I think that's part of its healing, is it not? To go through this process. Don't sweep it under the rug. And Jeremiah is a great example. He has no problem. He's letting it all out. In fact, in verse 16 and on, it's a symbol of mourning that you're going to see here. He describes it. He says, God has ground my teeth on gravel. Like, first of all, if anybody sleeps and they grind their teeth, that's really like, you don't even like that sound. Can you imagine grinding your teeth, on gravel? And then he made me cower in the dust. Oh man. Now there's some of the backdrop. I didn't know this, and I think this is an interesting fact. John MacArthur says this could be even referencing the grit that was mixed with the bread that was baked in ashes. And so it could have even been the food that he was making, but because it was such a destruction with the ashes and the dust and the gravel, put it all together. That's actually what he was eating, because maybe that's all he had. Made me cower in the dust. You're feeding on the dirt. Verse 17 and on, my soul has deprived of peace. I have forgotten what happiness is. Can I just say, people that are dealing with distress and depression and lamenting, can you not connect with that verse? I've forgotten what happiness is. To be really frank with Revive School, the studying process has been really, at times, and I know it's the Word of God, but it's still heavy. I was joking with you guys yesterday, like I had finished studying early. Okay, I had an afternoon and an evening where I didn't have to go study. And I actually told Sean, I told Rich, I told my wife, I was like, wow, it's actually kind of freeing. It's almost like you forget when you're in this routine, in this rut, whatever it is, it's almost like you forgot sometimes about what the other times were like. And those that are dealing with really destruction and distress, sometimes you've forgotten what it is. And look what he says in verse 18. Then I thought, my future is lost as well as my hope from the Lord. So when you've gone through something so tragic, you think there's literally no hope. Can I just tell you, Jeremiah provides you something completely different. He provides you with hope. Keep going, Kevin, if you can. Remember my affliction and my homelessness? You know when he says homelessness, it probably means I got nothing. The wormwood and the poison, remember this? He's trying to, I think this is interesting. He's trying to change his mindset by thinking back. And then he says in verse 20, I continually remember them and have become depressed. I'm trying, God, to get through this. And yet every time I think about all this, life just stinks. I have become depressed. Who wants to read a chapter in the Bible that talks about depression? Well, it's Lamentations 3. But now watch this, you guys. Here's where it changes. Jeremiah's distress now becomes Jeremiah's hope. Praise God. We don't just stay there. And that's the difference, you guys, between lamenting, staying there and being okay with it, or moving on. He says, yet I call this to mind, and therefore I have hope. Okay, this relentless sorrow about the judgment that falls upon Judah, here's what's fun, is that it can change. In verse 22, 23, and 24, okay, this is the crux of all of Lamentations. This is the part that you actually quote from Lamentations. Because of the Lord's faithful love, we do not perish. Okay, you have to understand something. The people are being scattered, taken into captivity. Their home is being destroyed. And yet Jeremiah says, because of the Lord's faithful love, we do not perish. And I love this, for his mercies never end. This word mercies, it's used about 250 times in the Old Testament. Okay, I want to read, there's 8 truths that are tied into the word mercies. Just hang in here, okay? This is kind of an interesting one, okay? It's described as this. John MacArthur says, it's a comprehensive term, the word mercies, that encompasses love, grace, mercy, goodness, forgiveness, truth, compassion, and faithfulness. When you think of mercies, it's all of those. God continues to pour out his love, his grace, his mercy, his goodness, his forgiveness, his truth, his compassion, and his faithfulness. And by the way, in verse 23, here it is. They're every day. God pours out his mercies. They're new every morning. So when Jeremiah is lying in bed, if he even has a bed, if he's lying on the dirt, holding on, baked bread with gravel and dust, he knows that every morning God's mercies are still there. Night times are the weirdest, aren't they, when you deal with depression and loneliness and life situations that just suck? Every morning, guess what happens? The sun still comes up. And every morning you can experience God's mercies. I actually had this conversation with my daughter Maya about track. Because at night she has a hard time. She'll be like, man, this is hard. This is just hard. And I go, don't worry. God's mercies are new every morning. And she goes, and so is track. And so your situation might not change. Does that make sense? You still might have to actually go through the things that you're dealing with at night, but God says, I'm still with you every single day. They're new every morning. I am with you. And then look what Jeremiah says. Great is your faithfulness. And then here you go. Verse 24 is the theme for all of Lamentations for us. Remember, we're saying, God, where do we see the Messiah? Where do we see your presence in this book? And Jeremiah says, I say, the Lord is my portion. Therefore, I will put my hope in him. So here you have this. Jeremiah's hope is my portion. So this mindset of God is all you need. You don't need the land. You don't need the food. You actually don't need family or friends. All you need is God. I love this image of I am your portion. Kevin, I was praying through this a little bit. Can you go to John 4, verse 13? And I think for me, I want to tie in Mindy's painting because to me, this water represents the mercies. This represents a cistern that God just says, I'm going to continue to pour it out onto you even when you don't think this can happen. Every day, he says, I'm going to pour this into you. So Jesus is talking to the Samaritan woman, okay, in John 4. And then there's this interesting picture, and Jesus says, everyone who drinks from this water will get thirsty again. And then it continues on, but whoever drinks from the water that I will give him will never get thirsty again. Ever. In fact, the water I will give him will become a well of water springing up within him for eternal life. To me, this is a description of my portion. This is a description of like, hey, this is all you need. And in fact, Kevin, if we keep going back to the other things, it dries up. If we put our stock in Dallas, Texas and say, man, I love Dallas. I love the Mavs. I love the Cowboys. Guess what? They're going to have a bad year. I love my job. Guess what? You might have a bad year at your job. Or I love my kids that they're listening. Guess what? There's going to be a year that they're not going to. My point is this. Whenever we put our stock in anything but God, you ready for this one? They'll probably fail you. It will never live up to your standards. And Jeremiah is just saying, you know what? Jerusalem's gone. People of Judah, they sinned. All I have, my only portion to get through any of this distress is God himself. Therefore, because he is my portion, I will what? Put my hope in him. You cannot, in a time of depression, in a time of loneliness, in a time of lamenting, put your own hope in yourself. Because guess what happens? You're just kind of going around in circles after circles after circles, and you're like, wow, this isn't working, and you'll get dizzy. You got to put your hope in him. Kevin, can you go to Psalm 119, verse 57, Kevin, if you don't mind? Psalm 119, verse 57 says, the Lord is my portion. I have promised to keep your words. This is what I want to do with this. Just look, how do you keep God your portion? Like, do you just say it? Well, God is my portion. Look, I got to tell you this. You have to be in his word. In order to understand that he's your portion, you have to be on your knees and in the word. I'm telling you, there's no other way around. I don't know else how people do this. How else do you get through this, Kevin? How else do you have God as your portion without getting to know him in a relationship?
Well, that's what society's tried to do, though. They want all the benefits, but not any of the work.
Can I just tell you that's what the Israelites did? Jeremiah gave them the word, and they didn't want it. And so the only way to get through this time period is to go back to his word, to hang on to, yes, God as your portion. And verse 25 and 26 really spoke to me. I don't know how far we'll get into today, but in verse 25 and 26, look at this. If he's your portion, look what he says. The Lord is good to those who wait for him. So you know what that means? It means God, when it says he's your portion, it doesn't mean it's like an instant gratification, plug in the numbers on the microwave and God's instantly going to show something to you. No, the Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the person who seeks him. And you can say, well, how does doesn't that contradict waiting and seeking? No, not at all. And actually, when you're waiting on the Lord, you're actually crying out to him. You're intentionally talking to him and you're saying, God, I need you to show up, but I'm not going to do anything until you show up. There's a process, I think, that we have to accept. And I love what Nelson's commentary says. This is truly an acceptance of God's will and his timing and not yours. You're actually okay with embracing God as your portion, and you're not going to try to figure it out. The problem with the distress, you know what we do? We do dumb things to try to get us out of it. And you know what happens? You just keep spinning in circles. And if you're not careful, you'll start digging yourself more into a hole. So he says in verse 26, it is good to wait quietly for deliverance from the Lord. I don't think it's worth holding up signs saying life sucks. God, where are you? No, just trust confidently that he's going to speak to you. Trust confidently that he's going to reveal himself to you. So we wait on him knowing that we're going to be delivered from this situation. In Jeremiah's situation, I don't know how it looked good. Cities destroyed, people are gone, thrown into captivity. Here he is hanging out. He probably hasn't gone into Egypt yet, more than likely, and he's waiting for God to show up. It's interesting, in verse 27, says it is good for a man to bear the yoke while he is still young. You know, there's a thought that many people are going through this process, like to grow. But it's better to go through this process when you're young than when you're older, right? I mean, that's really what we're saying. Maybe the discipline side of even some of this. And then in verse 28 it says, let him sit alone and be silent, for God has disciplined him. I want you to go through with this and be okay with this. Like, I want you to embrace this. If you really believe that God is your portion, then look at this. In verse 29, let him put his mouth in the dust. In other words, be quiet and submit yourself. Perhaps there is still hope. Now in verse 30, there's a little picture of the Messiah here, just a little. Let him offer his cheek to the one who would strike him. Let him be filled with shame. In other words, just embrace what you're going through. Let him offer his cheek to the one who would strike him. In other words, don't try to fight back. Just turn the cheek and say, okay, go ahead, hit me. Jesus does the same thing, Kevin, in Isaiah 50, verse 6. Think about this picture. Okay, again, not saying completely. I just think it's an interesting picture of what we could see. He says in Isaiah 50, verse 6, I give my back to those who beat me, and my cheeks to those who tore out my beard. I did not hide my face from scorn and spitting. What do you have here? A description of embracing what the enemy is coming against you that God is allowing. Does that make sense? God is allowing this to take place. And I think it's interesting. He says, submit yourself. Why? Because if you go back to Lamentations 3, verse 31, for the Lord will not reject us forever. So this time of distress, when you have hope in him, it's not going to last our lifetime. Even if he causes suffering, he will show compassion according to his abundant faithful love. I have to read verse 33. It says this, for he does not enjoy bringing affliction or suffering on mankind. He doesn't delight in this, you guys. But there is a just base for the judgment that's falling on mankind. I'm just going to close out onto all of this section here. Crushing all the prisoners of the land beneath one's feet, denying justice to a man in the presence of the Most High, or suppressing a person's lawsuit. The Lord does not approve of these things. Who is there who speaks and it happens unless the Lord has ordained it? You understand that, right? The Lord is in control of all of this. And then in verse 38, do not both adversity and good come from the mouth of the Most High. Can I just tell you this? When Jeremiah believes that God is in control, that's when you understand you have hope. When you believe that God is still going to intervene, whether it's in a bad thing or a good thing, then you realize you have hope. You want to know why? Because it's not based on you anymore. Look, I'm telling you, you can stay in this place of distress, or you can stay in this place of hope. And hope is what pulls us out of the cistern and gets refreshed by his presence. To me, that's Lamentations. You know, when you get through verses 39 through 66, you're going to begin to hear, and this is how I'll wrap it up with Jeremiah's, and I like what John MacArthur says, you'll begin to hear about Jeremiah's counsel and prayer. How to walk through this process once you've experienced it. All right, guys. Jeremiah is expressing through Lamentations 3 that no matter how hard life is, we still have hope. Why? Because he's our portion. All right, guys, we'll wrap up Lamentations tomorrow, and thanks for joining us. All right, guys, welcome back to Revive School. Here we are, lesson 52 within the section called the Major Prophets. If you're just tuning in, maybe on the radio or you're listening online, you haven't been caught up in a while. We've been going through the prophets. Here you have all of these prophets. We've gone through Isaiah, we've gone through Jeremiah, and now we're in a season called Lamentations. Most would say, and most would attribute the writings of Lamentations to Jeremiah. Now, we're going to get into, right after this, it's kind of crazy, we're going to get into Ezekiel. Man, you thought Isaiah and Jeremiah was hard? Wait till you see this guy's visions. I mean, these are unbelievable. Then we're going to get into Daniel. And so all of these, here's the point of all this. They all point to hope. They all point to the Messiah coming in all of this destruction and this distress. No matter how hard things are, you have to hold on to, he is our portion. He's our cup. He is everything that we have, that we need. And that's why I love Mindy's painting, because to me, Kevin, look at this incredible painting of Mindy's. It's pretty dark and gloomy. And yet, every day, he continues to pour out his mercies afresh into our lives. And Kevin, you were talking about this offline, and I love this image. Okay, now remember, over here, we have Isaiah and we have Jeremiah's paintings. In Jeremiah's painting, remember he was thrown into a cistern? They didn't like the guy because he kept giving a prophetic word. The prophetic word was, hey, by the way, you're going to go into captivity. By the way, Israel's going to fall. By the way, Jerusalem's going to fall. I was like, these are the words. So, hey, let's just throw him into the cistern. So life is not that good for Jeremiah. Okay, so he's in a cistern. And if you could just picture Mindy, painted a cistern here. But I love, Kevin, what you had said. We had talked about this, the difference between a fountain and a cistern. You want to allude to, picture Jeremiah in a cistern, but then look what keeps happening.
Well, a cistern doesn't have a source on its own. It's a holding tank, basically. It needs its source somewhere else, where a fountain is a continual source. And the fountain, Christ, his portion fills the cistern.
And so here you have, this cannot come from Jeremiah. This can't come from Isaiah. This can't come from the folks from Judah. This can't come from the Israelites. No, the portion and the mercies can only come from God. So no matter how hard a situation is, whether you're stuck in a cistern or not, let God pour it out. It's like us, Kevin, when we were in North Dakota on Christmas Eve. I've loved this story. We're in Michigan, North Dakota, not too far from where you and Tom, lived outside of Devil's Lake. And we got stuck on the side of the road. Within 2 miles, I think there was like 60 some cars. They're all stuck on the side of the road. The roads were horrible. It was a ground blizzard, 0-degree visibility. And I remember we were literally on the side of the road. My dad just started praying. There was nothing we could do. I mean, nothing we could do to get out of the situation. If we got out of the car, Kevin, what would happen?
Freeze.
You'd freeze. If you stayed in the car, Kevin, what would happen?
You freeze.
You'd freeze. There was nothing we could do, but yet what did God do? He sent 2 farmers in trucks to go and pick up everybody. Like, God will pour out himself, his mercies, his grace, to all of us in our situation. Now, what if we stayed there 5-6 hours? I don't know the timing of how long you have to go through your period of time in the cistern, but you just have to trust that God is your portion, because in Lamentations 3:25, it says you wait on him in the process. He says the Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the person who seeks him. So when my dad cried out to the Lord, I actually believe God heard our prayer. It just doesn't mean we don't know when the farmer's going to show up. We don't know when God's going to restore Jerusalem. We don't know when God's going to restore and bring restoration, bring revival back to the land of Israel. But it's good. God is good to those who wait for him. And that's what you see in Lamentations. You see a guy, Jeremiah, venting, pouring out to the Lord, woe is us. And in fact, if you guys remember when we first started talking about this a couple of days ago, Lamentations, okay, it actually means loud cries. So like when you are lamenting, I have no problem when you're just like, God, why? Like, it's okay to pour it out. I mean, that word how, Kevin, if you go to Lamentations 1:1, how she sits alone. Here you have Jeremiah's sorrow about what? About Jerusalem, who's been completely wiped out. The city once crowded with people. She was great among the nations. And so he begins to describe, and so there's that word how. That word how actually expresses dismay. I have no problem in a period of time in a cistern if you are articulating, crying out to the Lord, what in the world is going on? But I have to have you understand one thing. As you're articulating this, you know in your heart of hearts that God's going to get you out of this. that God is your portion. He's going to continue to pour out his mercies. You just don't know when. And so in that process of waiting, you have to keep praying and crying out to the Lord. And that's really what you see, you guys, in Lamentations 5. Lamentations 5 is truly a prayer, a cry for, some people would say attention, some would say for revival, some would say for renewal. But either way, God, I need you to show up. It's kind of a cool picture. You know, I know we didn't talk much about Lamentations 4, but I will tell you this. Philip Graham Ryken just describes Lamentations 4 as a crying out because Jeremiah recognizes there's been a failure of leadership in its costs, Ryken says, in its causes, and its in conclusion. So all of this, that there's a failure of that, but now we're saying, God, would you please show up? And in fact, the first really 18 verses, that's what you have. You have a plea, Ryken says, for attention. Jeremiah is asking for attention from who? From the Lord. Lord, help me. I need a marker. It's a plea for attention in the first 18 verses. So he says this in verse 1, Yahweh, remember, I'm in Lamentations 5:1, Yahweh, remember what has happened to us. Kevin, if you can go to Lamentations 5:1. Thanks. Yahweh, remember what has happened to us. Look and see our disgrace. Now, John Mackay, it's M-A-C-K-A-Y, Mackay, it's probably John Mackay. John Mackay says this, okay, think about this. This is interesting here. He says, okay, there's clearly a plea for attention. Kevin, what kind of attention does Jeremiah want?
He's just wanting a remembrance.
Constable says this, Tom Constable, remember the calamity. Here's what he wants him to remember. Remember the calamity that has fallen on your people. And I need you, Lord, to consider the reproach in which we now are living. Like, okay, God, hello, have you not seen our conditions? Have you not seen our environment? And then he says the humbled condition of Judah reflected. Now, this is where it gets interesting about this plea for attention. He wants God to see how poorly, that what they're going through. Let me put it a different way. The Judahites reflected poorly on the Lord because the pagans would have concluded, that God was unable to keep his people strong and prosperous. God, if you'll look at this situation right now, whether we're in a cistern or we have no homes, hey, God, by the way, this doesn't look good on you. Remember what's happened to us? Look and see our disgrace. But our disgrace is really, what is he saying? Yours, God. Tom Constable says, if God would have remembered his people, this plea for attention, then surely he would act on that and deliver them. And I think that's part of our prayer sometimes, isn't it? God, I need you to show up because this just doesn't look good on you. Really, I need to get out of this. Can you go to Exodus 2:24 and 25, please? Yahweh, remember what has happened to us and look and see our disgrace. In Exodus 2:24 and 25, it says, so God heard their groaning and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Verse 25, God saw the Israelites and he took notice. God, please remember your promise. In verse 2, and back in Lamentations 5:2, it says, our inheritance has been turned over to strangers. Like our down payment, remember that you gave us the land? We don't own it anymore. You've given it to strangers. Our houses now are run by foreigners. In other words, the promised land ain't so promised. It's just become land now, and it's been given to strangers and our houses to foreigners. Kind of like, God, are you still keeping in your covenant? Like, this is kind of the mentality, is it not? God, you've given this up to everybody. And now in verse 3, he says we become orphans. Like, when I think of an orphan, I think of I have no home. I'm in somebody else's place. I'm fatherless. Our mothers are widows. In other words, we kind of feel like we're foreigners now. Can you go to Exodus 22:21? This is an interesting take, an interesting perspective on this. It says, you must not, remember this, scripture says, you must not exploit a foreign resident or oppress him since you are foreigners in the land of Egypt. It's almost like saying, hey, God, this is who we've become. God, Like we're supposed to take care of people. Please take care of us. You have to wonder sometimes, did this fall on them? In Exodus 22:22 says, you must not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. You kind of have to wonder, Kevin, if they did that. You have to wonder if they mistreated any widows or any fatherless child. And now here they're saying, this is us. Verse 4, this is really this is not comical, it's actually sad. We must pay for the water we drink. Our wood comes at a price. In other words, the normal commodities that you would normally just like you would have for free, they now have to pay. Like they have to pay for water now. Man, like living in the city, like you have to pay for your water. You go back to Indiana and your parents have a well, you don't have to pay for water. Like it's kind of that feeling. Like you feel a little bit of like, what, we got to pay this now? Why would we have to pay this? This is not how it was actually designed. And in verse 5, he says, we're closely pursued, we're tired, and no one offers us rest. Kevin, what was the promised land supposed to be?
Rest.
A place of rest. And now all of a sudden, here they are in their own land, or if not in their own land, can you go to the other map for me? The purple map? You have the purple map? You don't have the purple map. That was last week's purple map. Here they are now in captivity. So they're either in captivity where they have no rest, or they're in their own land and they have no rest. But God is the one who offers rest. It goes back to the understanding of, man, this is not how God designed it. So what you see in the first 10 verses, and John Mackey just calls it, and this is kind of an obvious thing, but I think it's interesting. In a plea for attention, in this time of distress, they experience economic and political destitution. And why this is important is look, I think some of these, you guys, are signs of sin. Think about this. Because of their sin, this is what they experience, correct? Lamentations 5:6 says, well, then here's what happened. We made a treaty with Egypt and with Assyria to get enough food. In other words, they submitted to not the Lord. They made unholy, as one commentator says, alliance with the Egyptians and the Assyrians, and they put more of their trust in man and in those kings than in the Lord. And now here they are begging for food. Now here they are paying for food. And then in verse 7, listen to this. This is kind of a really drastic verse. It says, our fathers sinned. They no longer exist, but we bear their punishment. So because of what a family generation brought upon them, they're dealing with, right? Yes. But at the same time, they still didn't get it figured out for themselves. So no longer can they put this just on their parents. But we bear their punishment, yes, but we also bring it upon ourselves. Kevin, what do you want to add to that?
Well, it's kind of funny because how many generations do you want to go back to?
Can you go to Jeremiah 31, 29 and 30 for me for a second? Yeah, how far do you have to go back? I mean, it's constant. Jeremiah 31, 29 says, in those days it will never again be said, the fathers have eaten sour grapes and the children's teeth are set on edge. Verse 30, rather each will die for his own wrongdoing. Anyone who eats sour grapes, his own teeth will be set on the edge. So in other words, what you see is yes, the father sinned, but the scripture also says, but you're going through this because you brought this on yourself as well. So it really is both and.
Jeremiah prophecy, God said, I'll give you another chance.
They didn't want it. And in verse, go back to Lamentations 5:8, slaves now rule over us. No one rescues us from their hands. So everything that has been set up is the opposite now. Now all of a sudden their slaves, quote unquote, rule over them, and then there's nobody to rescue them. So here you have this plea, this cry, this prayer for God, would you not forget us? Lamentations 5:9 says we secure our food at the risk of our lives because of the sword in the wilderness. In other words, like food was so scarce. Now, remember, here's the situation. You got to keep pulling back to the current situation. Jerusalem has been destroyed. Jeremiah is lamenting. He's probably seen the fire. He's probably seen the swords. He's probably seen the pestilence. He's probably seen the famine. He's probably seen it all, the plague. He's seen all of this. Food is barely there. Remember, we just talked about yesterday that he might even been eating bread with gravel and dust in it as he's eating because it's so scarce to put something together. So if they do want to find food, they have to leave their environment to go out and risk of probably maybe the Chaldeans coming in and killing them. Coming in, here you have the Babylonians coming in and killing them because they want food. And then he says in verse 10, our skin is as hot as an oven from the ravages of hunger. So even now, our skin is as hot is probably alluding to even a disease. Like we become so sick from the ravages of hunger. And then, so here you have this economic and political destitution. Okay, I think that's pretty clear of what we've just seen. Everything's falling apart, economically, politically. But now you see, and John McKay says this, you see, and I think this is very clear, personal humiliation and abuse. Like he's really describing something very, very graphic here. So these things that I'm saying, you have to understand, this is how Jeremiah describes how bad it's gotten. He says, women are raped in Zion. Okay? What that implies is that women then have, by force, men have come in and done things that are not of the Lord to them, and they have no control. Virgins in the cities of Judah, like everything, these girls are virgins in the cities, like everybody is like, they've been personally humiliated and they're abused. In verse 12, it says, princes, 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 are hung up by their hands. Elders are shown no respect. This is an interesting, when you do a little bit more in depth here. There was a study done that Nebuchadnezzar didn't really ever torture his victims. Okay, so what would this mean then? It means that after these guys died, that men were hung up after their death as a form of dishonor. So this could have been here, King Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians are coming in, they're already dead, and now they're hanging them up by their hands. It's a possible perspective. But this was done in order to dishonor those from Judah. So here you have humiliation, here you have abuse taking place, and Jeremiah is witnessing it all. Lamentations 5:13, it says, young men labor at millstones, boys stumble under loads of wood. Now, what are they doing? They're living like animals. They're doing labor like animals, like they're grinding grain like animals. And in fact, Tom Constable says, here you have small boys buckling under loads of firewood. Like the conditions are just awful. If abuse isn't happening to women, the boys and the men are dealing with hard labor. And it says in verse 14, the elders have left the city gate, the young men their music. Verse 15, this is really how bad it's gotten, is that you begin to see, and John McKay says it this way, you begin to see hopeless desolation. It's almost like, Kevin, we forgot, isn't it? It's almost like we forgot about Lamentations 3, 22, 23, and 24. It's almost like we forgot that God pours out his mercies new every morning. And isn't this true? Isn't this, I mean, it's just, it's almost like Lamentations 3, like it's almost like he wrote that in the morning. It's almost like, oh yeah, God is good. God is my portion. He's my cup. He's everything. He's my hope. But then as throughout the day goes, I know this isn't probably how he wrote it, but this is how I think we do in life, is that you understand his mercies, but as you go back through life, you've left your quiet time with the Lord. Now you've gone out into the city, and then you actually experience women being abused. You see men being hung. You see kids barely making this. And what happens? You begin to become depressed again. Right? Isn't this kind of this crazy cycle of understanding that God is our portion, God is our hope. He's new every morning. And then you go through the day and you're like, I can't believe this is awful. Like this is kind of what I hear in this. In fact, he even says, and this is really bad, in verse 15, joy has left our heart. Our dancing has turned to mourning. Like there's no joy, there's no dancing. And can I just tell you, this is simply because of sin. Sin has literally crept into the camp to the point where like there's no joy, there's no dancing. It makes you think of Ecclesiastes, Kevin, if you go there. The words of Solomon, Ecclesiastes 3, verse 4. I don't know how else to describe this. There's a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance. It's a great picture of the destruction of Jerusalem. Joy has left our hearts. Our dancing has turned to mourning. But this also paints a picture of, like, let's just not make it, this happened because of sin. This happened because the Israelites, like, this isn't God's fault. This isn't God's, like, I can't believe God did this. No, no, no. This is because they brought this on themselves. Here's where it gets interesting. In verse 16, it says, the crown has fallen from our head. Woe to us, and here's what Jeremiah says, for we have sinned. This crown image, okay, Kevin, if I go back to Isaiah, here you have the crown. Remember the righteous branch of David. So what do we know? That the lineage is going to come through King David, right? 2 Samuel 7. The lineage is going to come through, the Messiah is going to come through, yes, the kingship of David. And what does Jeremiah say when he's looking at the city? We've lost the crown. Kevin, what is he implying?
There's no king.
We've lost it. Why? Because we have sinned. Please don't miss this. He says in 17 and 18, I'm going to come back to verse 16. Because of this, because we've lost the crown, our heart is sick. Because of these, our eyes grow dim. And then he says, because of Mount Zion, which lies desolate and has jackals prowling in it, because there's wild foxes or jackals running around. In other words, it's literally been overcome. Why? Because we have no king. Like what John MacArthur said, he says that the Davidic monarchy was temporarily over. And for all that Jeremiah could see, he couldn't see anything else. And it doesn't be resumed. The lineage of this crown being restored doesn't come, you guys, until Christ. Now, when we say Christ, remember our good old dots that we have here? Like, here's the current situation. And Kevin, here's the first coming, right? But even as the first coming comes, Kevin, he doesn't institute like the kingship permanently, does he? So really, we can only say that the crown is only established truly upon the return of Christ. Until that point, we'll always be wondering, has the crown fallen? Now, we know it's not true because we know that Christ is the answer. But if you don't see that, your heart will be sick, your eyes will grow dim, and you'll begin to wonder, why is Jerusalem fallen? Okay, guys, let's keep going here. I don't know. This could be our country today. This could be how we think. And so what does he do? You know, here's a cool picture here. Let's just see if let's try to write this here. John McKay just says, okay, for a plea for attention, and then in final and closing, he says, God, restore us, please. This is that prayer of renewal. God, restore us. He says in verse 19, you, Lord, are enthroned forever. Your throne endures from generation to generation. He says, why have you forgotten us forever? Abandon us for our entire lives. Lord, restore us to yourself, so we may return, renew our days as in former times, unless you have completely rejected us and are intensely angry with us. It's kind of like, don't you love this is a but, you know, like, God, please restore us, unless you're completely given up on us, unless you're completely angry with us. And so let's go back to verse 19 if we can, and just kind of begin to unpack just this a little bit more. Lord, you're enthroned forever. Your throne endures forever. Kevin, how is this interesting to you when it says your throne endures forever? But then what did we just talk about? The crown.
The crown is something that's it's put on someone. That doesn't mean that the establishment of the throne is gone.
He still believes just because we've screwed up, just because we've lost the crown, quote unquote, it's fallen, doesn't mean that God can't restore it. It doesn't mean that God can't overcome that horrific cistern situation or destruction of the city. No, God, I believe that you can still do this. You guys, you have to get to this point in your lamenting. You have to get to this point of pleading with God, God, please restore us, revive us, renew us. Otherwise, we're constantly staying in political destitution. We're constantly staying in economic destitution. You're constantly staying in humiliation or abuse or desolation. Like, that's the point that we can stay in. But God says, no, man, I have more for you. It's interesting, though, in verse 20, though, just because we believe that God can do this doesn't mean that we're becoming impatient. He says, why have you forgotten us forever? Why have you abandoned us for our entire lives? Like, God, here's the question. Why are you taking so long? Why are you taking so long to answer a simple question? Jeremiah prayed for the restoration and renewal. That's why he went to 21. Lord, restore us to yourself. You know, somebody once said, where do you see a prayer for revival in the Bible? Where do you ever see a prayer for restoration or renewal? Lamentations 5:21 is one of the best pictures ever. How do we know? Because we know that when we look at physically at Jerusalem, it's a mess. Emotionally, Kevin, they're a mess. Here's what's crazy. Spiritually, they're a mess. They've turned away completely from the Lord. And yet you have one man named Jeremiah interceding on behalf of the Israelites. God, please restore us back to you, so that we can actually come back. Restore us so that we can return. Renew our days. And Kevin, what does he do? Back to the good old days. The good old days to me, you know what it is? All the way back when they established a covenant with Moses. God, please establish the promise that you gave to Abraham. God, I want to renew. I want to experience what you originally promised. So I think it's so important to be in the Word. You need to know what God promised, because if we've ever strayed away, we need to say, God, take us back to that point. I think in America, I think it's crazy that we're constantly trying to remove all the historical stuff. If you remove the historical stuff, you'll never remember where we came from. And can I just tell you, I don't care how you have studied this or which way you've studied this, our nation was founded upon the principles of the Word of God. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. In God we trust. So God, please restore us as believers back to yourself. Restore us as Americans back to you. Renew our days as in former times. It truly is a cry for revival. God, I'm looking at something that it looks horrific. It's interesting, though, in verse 22, this is how he closes his lament. God, I want you to bring revival. However, in verse 22, unless you've completely rejected us and are intensely angry with us, unless, God, it's not your will, don't do it. That's why I love this prayer. I love Lamentations 5:21 and 22. God, I need you to bring revival, but if you want us to not experience it, okay. When you have that type of prayer, you know that one thing happens and one thing is true. God's in charge and we're not. This is a man of God prayer that I love. It's not a manipulative prayer. It's not a, hey, if I do this, this can happen. No, God, I want to see true revival for my people. I want to experience it. But God, if you've rejected us and are intensely angry with us, it's not going to happen. This is Lamentations. Lamentations is 5 chapters, 5 poems, 5 times of crying out to the Lord. And you know what the end game is? God, I just need you to show up in my life. I need you to be my portion. And there you have, and thus concludes the book of Lamentations. Tomorrow begins a humdinger, the visions of Ezekiel. I hope you'll join us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow. Thanks.